According to this poll I made, the majority of you are running the game at subpar FPS. So I built a PC specifically for this video, and it's pretty much the lowest end parts that I consider a baseline for 2022. There are slower parts out there like X79 Xeons with DDR3, but I wouldn't bother with these in this day and age. We're going to cover PC build parts, where I'm going to tier out practically everything on the market in the past 6 years, and how to find bottlenecks based on these tiers. Then cover what to optimize in settings and what to upgrade or overclock based on your bottlenecks. It's difficult to generalize everything perfectly, so of course there are things you can nitpick, but this is what I recommend. If you think you're an expert, go ahead and drop a comment. Maybe there's something I missed. Let's start with the parts in my test build. I'm running a 6600K, the minimum you need for TARKOV. Intel has made barely any IPC improvements from 6th gen Skylake all the way to 11th gen Rocket Lake. So with overclocking I can easily match i3s from 11th gen. I'll consider this a tier 3 CPU, I'll explain the tiers later. For memory, I'm running 16GB of DDR4 at 3000 MHz CL16. For graphics card, I'm running a 1050 Ti, which is the bare minimum if you want the game to be playable. And the monitor I'm running is 1080p at 60Hz. These will be our graphics settings and NVIDIA settings for now. For advanced 3D settings in NVIDIA's control panel, check my previous video. RAM cleaning doesn't make a difference for me. If it does for you, turn it on. I don't use physical cores only because I don't notice a difference in performance with my build. Try it out, and if it helps, then go for it. Post effects is off this time around because we want as much performance as possible. For Intel 12th gen users, Windows doesn't know how to use eCores well for TARKOV. People in my Discord have reported that turning off eCores or using Process Lasso might help. When it comes to Windows power plan, registry fixes, and task scheduler tweaks, all of these fixes are software side. This video is mainly focused on hardware side. There are plenty of guides out there for these things already, and this video doesn't exist to repeat them. So try those out and see if it helps. If those guides did help, then what I'm showing you today will give you even more FPS. On to hardware, starting with CPU tiers. If your CPU is listed below and you're getting higher FPS than my approximation, this is probably because your chip is boosting to higher speeds. If your CPU is running at a similar frequency, but you're getting lower FPS, then your memory might be the bottleneck. I'll explain both deeper later. Tier 3 CPUs will bounce around 50 to 70 FPS. These include any Intel quad-core ranging from 6th gen to 11th gen. Clocked at 4.3 GHz. I'm using this frequency as the baseline because that's what the i3 10100 boosts to. On AMD's side, any CPU with at least 6 cores from Ryzen 1000 series Zen 1 and Ryzen 2000 series Zen Plus, which I'll place in tier 2.5. Now the Ryzen 2000 series is a special case. I'll explain why it's tier 2.5 later. And for the Ryzen 3000 series, any quad cores are also included in tier 2.5. For tier 2 CPUs, you should expect anywhere from 70 to 100 FPS. Clock speeds are less relevant here because 6-core consumer platforms boost high enough. If you have an older HEDT Skylake X platform, X299, then just clock your chip to 4.3 GHz and it'll hold. The rest of Intel's product stack includes any 6-core or higher from Skylake to 11th gen. So 8600K all the way up to 11700K for Intel. On AMD's side, you got 6-core or higher Ryzen 3000 series Zen 2. And the weaker stack of Ryzen 5000 series, which is the 5500 and below. This includes the Ryzen 4500. Tier 3 CPUs are current gen chips, which will give you the best FPS. They include Intel 12th gen and Ryzen 5600 and above. On to memory. The minimum amount of memory I recommend is 24GB for zero stutter. This is a special case where you're running 2 sticks of 8 and 2 sticks of 4 in dual channel, but normally you would see 16 or 32. However, 16GB is playable, which is why I'm using it for my test rig. TARKOV scales really well with memory speeds, so you should be running at least 3000 MHz. Virtually any DDR4 after the very first iteration of DDR4's release will hit 3000 MHz. Higher memory speeds are better, but I've noticed on most platforms, if you can reach around 3400 MHz, the bottleneck becomes your CPU or memory timings. I'll explain more in the overclocking section. Now about the tier 2.5 CPUs. Ryzen is a multi-die design that are glued together with what they call infinity fabric. And older Ryzens are bottlenecked by the glue. How fast this glue can transfer information is tied to your memory speeds. So if you can clock your memory higher while maintaining 1-to-1 FCLK ratios, there's a setting in BIOS for this. Your CPU will perform faster. You can reach tier 2 performance if you have a good enough RAM kit and a good enough IMC on your chip to reach around 3400 MHz CL16. This also applies to Ryzen 3100 and 3300X. Before I upgraded to the Ryzen 5600, I ran my 3100 with 3800 MHz CL16 and it did 70 FPS minimum on all maps, including Lighthouse. Now for graphics cards, it'll be separated into tiers again. TARKOV needs a minimum of 3GB of VRAM. If you have a 2GB card, toss your card out and buy a new one. There will be no FPS numbers here. Why? Because there's a plethora of settings you can tweak to help your GPU load. There are no such settings for CPU load, so to maximize performance, we're trying to make the CPU our bottleneck. Theoretical performance within a tier will be slowest to fastest, left to right. There's too much to read out, so here's tier 4. Pause the video if you need to. Cards like the 970 and the 1063GB are relegated here for its lack of VRAM. I did not forget the 7950, 7970, 280, and 280X. These cards are fast enough, but they don't support FreeSync, and you should expect FPS drops in this tier of GPUs, so FreeSync and G-Sync are mandatory. These are basically tier 2 cards but with a lack of VRAM, so MIP streaming might be needed, which puts load on your CPU, lowering your FPS. Don't start vehemently defending your purchase like a fanboy. I know these cards are plenty fast, but the moment TARKOV decides it needs a little more VRAM and your graphics card starts swapping from VRAM to system memory is the moment where you will microstutter. Here are your tier 2 cards. These cards have enough VRAM to not require MIP streaming, and by lowering your graphics settings you can remove your GPU as a performance variable. We want this because we want the bottleneck to be our CPU. Tier 1 cards you can run almost any graphics settings at 1080p. This is where you'll notice changing your settings will not give you more FPS. This isn't because Nikita is a bad person, this is because your bottleneck is now CPU or memory. Now on to finding your bottlenecks, tweaking your PC, and what to upgrade first. Having MSI Afterburners on-screen display with CPU usage, GPU usage, and both RAM and VRAM loads are very helpful. For bottlenecks, I'll make it quick and simple. You can go to Linus Tech Tips or something if you want in-depth. Essentially, you can tweak any setting that lowers the load on one of 3 things: CPU, memory, or GPU. If lowering that setting doesn't give you better performance, then that piece of hardware wasn't the bottleneck. Now on to optimizing your graphics card. Follow my previous settings video, do not use MIP streaming, RSR, DLSS, or NIS yet. If changing your graphics settings do not affect FPS, your bottleneck is CPU or memory. If it does give you better FPS, then leave it there for now. If you're getting stutters or drops, then check to see if your VRAM is maxing out. If it is, turn on DLSS, FSR, or NIS. If your card supports DLSS, choose DLSS. If it doesn't, pick FSR for performance and NIS if available for quality. I personally don't notice the difference between these two in terms of quality, and FSR does give a tiny bit more performance. But some people say FSR looks blurry. If VRAM is still maxing out after upscaling, then turn on MIP streaming. For MIP streaming buffer size, I like to max this out. I haven't noticed the difference, but more buffer probably needs some more leeway on your GPU. I max out disk usage limit for the same reason. However, if your game is on a mechanical hard drive and not an SSD, you should lower it to 256 or 512 depending on your hard drive. Let's use this Amazon bestseller for example. Notice how it says 256 megs of cache? This means your hard drive has 256 MB of fast memory, so your disk usage limit should be set to 256. Some pricier hard drives have 512 MB of cache. If your game is on one of these, then you can change your usage limit to 512. Generally, if you're a tier 4 GPU, you'll need both FSR and MIP streaming. If you're on a tier 3 GPU, then only run FSR and see if your VRAM is still maxed out. Newer GPUs have better memory compression algorithms, so 4GB used on an R9290 might only be 3 on a 1650. You want a bit of headroom, so if you have 4GB of VRAM, you want this to average around 3800 MB. If it's still maxing out, then turn on MIP streaming. You want to avoid MIP streaming on slower CPUs because it uses CPU resources to load textures onto VRAM, but the game is unplayable without it on slower GPUs like the ones in tier 4. If you have a tier 1 or 2 GPU, then you can run whatever you want at 1080p. You're more than likely CPU or memory bottlenecked. After you do all of this, your GPU usage should not go over 90%. If it does, then your bottleneck is GPU. Either buy a new card or overclock. GPU overclocking is super easy on MSI Afterburner. I just drag power limits up and then clocks up. If it crashes, lower clock speeds. You should do GPU and memory one at a time, that way you know which one is the issue when you crash. One thing to note on overclocking VRAM, modern graphics cards with at least GDDR5 will have error correction, so you might not crash or artifact. But if the benchmark you're using gives you a lower score even though you clocked your memory higher, then that would mean your memory is unstable. Lower your memory clocks. The people at r/overclocking will gladly help. There are also guides in the sidebar in that subreddit. You can also join my Discord and check out the tech help channel. Now that graphics card is removed as a variable, onto RAM. If your system memory is clocked low, 2133 or 2666 are very common examples of low RAM speeds. We have to remove your memory as a variable by clocking it higher and aiming for at least 3000 MHz. Turning on XMP is enough 99% of the time. If you want more performance or you're running an old kit with no XMP profiles, then install Typhoon. Find your memory type and dump that into Ryzen DRAM calculator and it'll probably work. If it's unstable, then step down your frequency or loosen your timings. Loosening is more difficult, so I recommend lowering frequency. Again, you can visit our Overclocking for help on further tweaking or my Discord. Once we have your RAM fast enough, your CPU will be the bottleneck. If you're happy with this performance, you're done. If you're not and you have money, move on to the upgrades section of the video. If you're broke like me, keep watching. The way bottlenecks work is that each component in your system has a theoretical max performance. After the things we've done earlier, we now have CPU being the lowest performer. Which means if you clock your CPU higher, you'll get linear performance scaling all the way up until the next bottleneck. So let's say you're getting 50 FPS and your CPU is at 3.5 GHz. After tweaking our memory on our graphics card, if we clock your CPU to 4.5 GHz, it'll bring it to around 65 FPS. Overclocking CPUs are easy if you have an unlocked chip. Just bump your multiplier and run a benchmark. If you crash, you'll need to bump your voltage. Just keep bumping your voltage until you stop crashing while monitoring CPU temps. If you crash and your chip is getting too hot, that means you've ran out of temperature headroom. You'll then have to lower both voltage and clock speeds. You can find benchmarking tools in the sidebar of the R Overclocking subreddit, or I can link it to you in my Discord. Unfortunately, if you don't have an unlocked CPU, your only option is to bump base clock. It's unlikely you can hold over 110 base clock. If you get a really good chip, you might be able to get 115, but this is better than doing nothing. And for those who say it isn't that simple, besides my own PCs, I have a living example of someone overclocking and getting success in my Discord. Of course, I wouldn't recommend doing what he's doing. You should always do things manually. You'll have more control over what's going on. The automatic overclock systems usually put in more voltage than needed. Again, visit our Overclocking on my Discord if you need help. Once you've hit your max stable frequency for CPU and GPU, that's all the performance you can squeeze out of your PC. Your only choice now is to upgrade. If you're buying the stuff I'm recommending, you can support me by using my Amazon links down below, so I too can participate in the poison that's consumerism. If you only have 16GB of RAM, upgrade it first. TARKOV is a huge RAM hog. If you're seeing low usage on both CPU and GPU, it's probably because you only have 16GB of RAM, and you're being bottlenecked with your RAM swapping data with your drive. Some of you might not agree with this, but if you don't have FreeSync or G-Sync, the second thing you should upgrade is your monitor. Variable refresh rate technology is like magic. I would rather play on 50 FPS with FreeSync than 80 FPS 60Hz no FreeSync. Now you have to choose between CPU or GPU. Very simple, this is why I have everything in tiers. If your graphics card is tier 4, upgrade it first. If it's a tier 3, you can upgrade to tier 2 or 1, but try turning on MIP streaming first. If your graphics card is tier 2 or 1, then go for a CPU upgrade to the next tier. If you're AMD and you have an older 1st gen Ryzen, do not upgrade from Ryzen 1600 to something stupid like a 2700X. CPUs in the same tier will give you approximately the same performance in TARKOV. You should jump to a 3600 or 5600. Try to avoid the 5500 and 4500 as it lacks cache, making it an overclocked 3600. So if your budget is limited, just grab a used 3600 instead, it'll be cheaper. Or if you're an avid AliExpress shopper like me, you can pick up a 5500 for really cheap. For Intel users, if you have a locked CPU with a locked motherboard and overclocking base clock doesn't give you enough performance, you're gonna have to toss out your mobile and CPU. Pick up the latest platform and at least a Ryzen 5600 or i3-12100 depending on your budget. Buying the best CPU used in your respective platform is not worth the money unless you can get it for cheap, so just upgrade the whole thing altogether. Now if you have an unlocked CPU and motherboard, pick up better cooling. A Noctua NHD15 is a good example. Use it to try hitting higher clock speeds. This seems stupid, but a CPU cooler stays with you for decades. I'm still running a Hyper 212 Plus, not Evo, from 2009 on my main PC. A 6-core or higher Intel platform clocked at least 4.6 GHz is within an arm's length of the current generation mainstream CPUs like the Ryzen 5600 or i5-12600K at stock. And a 4-core overclocked is competitive with an i3-12100 or Ryzen 3600. If your cooling solution is equal to or greater than the NHD15, and it doesn't give you enough headroom to hit higher clock speeds, then you have no choice but to upgrade to one of the latest platforms. If you're building a brand new PC after watching this video and you're shopping for DDR4, be sure to pick up Patriot Viper Steels and the 16x2 sticks for 32 gigs, as they're guaranteed to be dual rank and probably the best RAM on market price to performance at the moment. For DDR5 I have no experience with, but I heard any kit with Hynix chips are good. Do some research. Now back to my example build and benchmarking methodology. I have a 6600K at a modest 4.3 GHz, 16GB of 3000 MHz CL16 memory, and a 1050 Ti overclocked. Now my CPU has headroom to go higher, but I want it to be around the same speed as an i3-10100 for demonstration purposes, and my current bottleneck for this PC is my 16GB of RAM and my graphics card. So there isn't a reason for me to clock my CPU higher when my GPU cannot keep up. Pause the video if you need to. For settings, here are my graphics settings. After following the steps I demonstrated earlier in the video, both MIP streaming and FSR is required for this PC. Post effects is off and I'm using NVIDIA control panel for colors. For benchmarking methodology, I see a lot of videos running low-end PC parts showing great performance in TARKOV. And without fail, in all of these videos, the game is being ran in an offline raid. With everything that goes on in an online raid, your frames will drop, so I have two separate numbers. One where I ran a specific route in an offline co-op raid, not offline single player, offline co-op, to emulate as close to online as possible, and one where I played an entire day on a specific map and took the average numbers in every game. I'll have a playlist in the description with unlisted videos of a small portion of all my runs, so you can just select a map, skip to a certain part of the map, or skip to fights and check how many frames I'm getting so you can use it as a comparison. This PC's performance is the bare minimum for TARKOV. If you have better parts and you're getting lower frames, then you'll have to do some tweaking. I chose 5 maps: Interchange, Reserve, Lighthouse, Shoreline, and Customs. I skipped Woods because it's very similar to the woody parts of Customs and Shoreline, and I skipped Factory and Labs because those two maps are great performers. First we have Interchange. It's the best performer out of all the maps. I benched both night and day because everyone loves night Interchange and there's no discernible performance difference between the two. Next we have Lighthouse, the worst performing map, shocker. Coming in at passable with FreeSync or G-Sync on, but it gets worse when you have to fight rogues and scoping through an optic cuts your already non-existent frames in half. Customs, second to Interchange when it comes to performance. Nothing much to say here, just very playable. Now for Shoreline, I spent most of my life in the resort. The only time I see green is on the way to resort and on the way out, so that might skew the frame rate a little bit. However, you can just go to the playlist with all the runs and see what kind of frame rate I get outside. Last map is Reserve, which used to be the worst performing map in the game, but now I'm getting better 1% lows than Shoreline. Let's just hope this level of optimization comes to Lighthouse. Now I know what you're thinking. These numbers are great, but you didn't bench the PC at stock? I tried, and with everything at stock I was getting mid-40s doing nothing but running around. And when I scope in it would drop to 30 FPS. I didn't want to suffer playing at that frame rate, so it's a trust me bro situation. But wait, there's something else I benched. Following my upgrade guideline, the first thing I upgraded in this PC should be going from 16 gigs to 32 gigs of RAM. So I went ahead and picked up a 16 gig kit. Unfortunately, the old kit can only clock up to 3000 MHz. So now we have 32 gigs of RAM at 3000 MHz. I only benched Lighthouse because this video is taking way too long at this point. And would you look at that, 65.85 FPS average with 1% lows of 37.6. And this is with me using a scope fighting rogues and looting. Both looting and scoping in with an optic drops FPS drastically. But we still maintained almost double our previous 1% lows. If you look at the top right corner, you can see our memory usage is well over 16 GB, which meant we were choked for RAM the entire time. This was only a $60 Canadian, which is like $45 to $50ish USD of an investment, and we almost doubled our 1% lows. So why do all this? Whether it's an in-game setting, a third-party app, or a Windows setting, every optimization video out there is at a software level. I personally don't see any performance gains no matter how much I mess with Windows. However, if you tweak at a hardware level, it guarantees you more frames. This video exists to help you recognize your bottlenecks and figure out what's stunting your performance. I've seen way too many threads out there complaining about how they have horrible FPS with a really strong CPU and GPU. And when you look at their build list, they're either XMP disabled running their RAM at 2133 MHz, or they only have 16 gigs of RAM. Meanwhile, I run over 100 FPS when I'm not streaming with a fairly mid-range PC, purely because I overclock my RAM like a madman. I swear I'm not sponsored, but Patriot Viper Steels is your best bet for high RAM speed for cheap at the moment. No amount of Windows settings tweaks will give me FPS like this. I hope this video helped. Comment, sub, bell, like. If you're overclocking, drop by the Discord and abuse my tech help channel. Check out the links in the description if you do plan on upgrading. Follow me on Twitch, I'll be streaming more often now that this video is done. Thanks for watching.